In 1947, one of the largest private homes ever built in the United States was reduced to rubble. Not by fire, not by war, not by natural disaster, but by choice. On Long Island's North Shore, overlooking the waters of Roslyn Harbor, a 140-room Beaux-Arts palace once commanded the skyline. Harbor Hill, completed in 1902. Designed by Stanford White of McKim, Mead White. Built for Clarence H. Mackay, heir to a telegraph and silver fortune that rivaled the Vanderbilts. It was modeled after a 17th-century French château. It cost millions at a time when a laborer earned less than $2 a day. It stood as a declaration that America's new aristocracy had arrived. And yet, just 45 years later, it was intentionally demolished. Why would a mansion that symbolized Gilded Age dominance be torn down in peacetime America? What changed between 1902 and 1947? How does a palace large enough to host royalty become less valuable than the land beneath it? Today, quiet suburban streets sit where terraces once overlooked formal gardens. Chapter 1: Architectural Tragedy, Opulent Decay. In 1947, one of the largest private residences ever constructed in the United States was deliberately torn apart. There was no fire racing through its corridors. No foreign army at its gates. No hurricane splintering its windows. There were only demolition crews, contracts, and a decision. On the north shore of Long Island, overlooking the calm waters of Roslyn Harbor, Harbor Hill had stood for 45 years. A 140-room Beaux-Arts palace completed in 1902 at the height of America's Gilded Age. Designed by Stanford White of the legendary firm McKim, Mead White, and built for Clarence H. Mackay, heir to a vast silver and telegraph fortune, the mansion was conceived not as a home, but as a statement. Its limestone facade rose in tiers of classical symmetry, inspired by the 17th-century Château de Maisons Laffitte in France. Terraces unfolded toward manicured gardens. Balustrades traced the skyline. From a distance, it did not resemble a private residence. It resembled a European seat of power transplanted onto American soil. Inside were ballrooms, galleries, libraries, servant quarters, reception halls. 140 rooms designed to project permanence. At a time when the average American worker earned less than $2 a day, Harbor Hill represented millions of dollars in construction costs alone. It was one of the great architectural declarations of the North Shore's Gold Coast, a region where industrial titans attempted to outbuild one another in stone. And yet by the late 1940s, that declaration had become inconvenient. The gardens were overgrown, the terraces weathered, the vast interiors increasingly silent. Clarence Mackay had died in 1938. The Great Depression had redefined wealth. Income taxes, estate taxes, and shifting economic realities had turned massive private estates into financial burdens. What once symbolized triumph now demanded endless maintenance. Heating alone required a small fortune. Staffing required an army that no longer existed. Developers began to circle. In post-war America, returning soldiers needed homes. Subdivisions were rising across Long Island. Land, not legacy, had become the new currency. Harbor Hill's 688 acres were no longer admired for their views. They were measured for their potential. And so, in 1947, demolition began. Stone was salvaged and sold. Architectural details were stripped. Walls that had once echoed with orchestras collapsed into dust. Within months, one of the grandest private homes in American history had vanished. In its place would come roads, parcels, and suburban houses, efficient, practical, profitable. Today, nothing of the original structure remains standing. No grand staircase. No limestone facade. Only fragments scattered across estates and museums. The terraces that once overlooked formal gardens now give way to quiet residential streets. Harbor Hill was not destroyed by catastrophe. It was dismantled by economics. Which raises a troubling question. Why would a nation wealthy enough to build such palaces decide they were no longer worth saving? What changed between 1902, when Harbor Hill was unveiled as a symbol of American aristocracy, and 1947, when it was erased without national protest? And how did the largest estates of the Gilded Age become liabilities in less than half a century? The demolition of Harbor Hill was not an isolated event. It was part of a larger pattern, a silent collapse of America's self-created nobility. Castles rose quickly in the 1890s. They disappeared just as quickly after the 1930s. To understand why Harbor Hill fell, we must step back to a moment when America's industrial elite believed wealth could purchase permanence. We must return to 1898, when a new aristocracy decided it needed castles. Chapter 2: America's New Royalty. By the final years of the 19th century, the United States had entered an age of staggering acceleration. Railroads stitched the continent together. Telegraph wires carried messages across states in seconds. Steel mills burned through the night. Oil fields surged. Fortunes were not accumulated over generations. They were manufactured in a single lifetime. Between 1870 and 1900, American industrial output multiplied at a pace the world had never witnessed. A new class of millionaires emerged almost overnight. Men who had once been merchants, engineers, speculators, or railroad executives now found themselves commanding wealth that rivaled European dynasties. But wealth alone was not enough. Europe had titles. Europe had castles. Europe had centuries of inherited legitimacy. America had money and ambition. And so, in the 1890s, the country's elite began constructing something it had never truly possessed: an artificial aristocracy. On the north shore of Long Island, within easy reach of Manhattan, yet removed from its noise, vast tracts of rolling land overlooked the Atlantic. It was here that America's industrial titans chose to build their summer estates. The press would eventually call it the Gold Coast. Visitors compared it to the French Riviera. Newspapers described it as the American Riviera. The Vanderbilts erected marble palaces. The Morgans secured sprawling estates. The Astas expanded their social dominion. Each mansion was larger than the last. Each facade more ornate. Each garden more precisely sculpted. Architecture became a language of competition. The estates were not merely residences. They were declarations. Ballrooms rivaled European courts. Formal gardens were modeled after Versailles. Limestone, marble, and imported stone signaled permanence. If the old world would not grant titles, America's new elite would carve their own legitimacy in stone. This was the true spirit of the Gilded Age, an era of extraordinary prosperity layered over fragile foundations. Beneath the elegance lay volatile markets, labor unrest, and growing inequality. But on the North Shore, those tensions felt distant. Here, wealth appeared untouchable. Summer after summer, carriages and later automobiles lined sweeping driveways. Orchestras played beneath chandeliers. Guests arrived in gowns and tailcoats. Servants moved quietly through corridors designed to conceal the machinery of luxury. The North Shore became a gallery of ambition. And yet, what defined this new aristocracy most was not inherited stability. It was urgency. These fortunes were new. They had been earned, not bestowed. And what was earned could be lost. That insecurity fueled extravagance. To build modestly would imply doubt. To build massively was to assert permanence. It was within this environment of rivalry, spectacle, and restless ambition that one family sought to leave an unmistakable mark. Among the Vanderbilts and Astors stood a man whose wealth flowed from silver mines and telegraph lines. He did not merely wish to participate in this new aristocracy. He intended to surpass it. And among them stood a man who inherited more than money. He inherited ambition. Chapter 3: Clarence Mackay, heir to a telegraph empire. Clarence Hungerford Mackay was born into a fortune that had already rewritten American possibility. His father, John William Mackay, had risen from poverty to unimaginable wealth through the Comstock lode, one of the richest silver discoveries in American history. By the 1870s, the elder Mackay was counted among the nation's financial titans. He later expanded his influence into communications, building the Postal Telegraph Company to rival Western Union and wiring the country with the nervous system of modern commerce. Silver had made the fortune. Telegraph wires sustained it. But Clarence would inherit the responsibility of defining it. When John Mackay died in 1902, the same year Harbor Hill was completed, Clarence assumed control of a business empire and a social position few Americans could comprehend. He was not merely wealthy. He was positioned among the upper tier of a newly forming aristocracy. a class determined to rival Europe's entrenched nobility. Yet inherited wealth carries a silent pressure. Clarence had not discovered the silver. He had not laid the first telegraph lines. His challenge was different, to prove that the second generation could equal or surpass the first. By the 1890s, the North Shore of Long Island had become the stage upon which America's elite performed their legitimacy. The Vanderbilts had already begun constructing Marble House in Newport, a structure so grand it seemed less a residence than a monument. Other industrial families followed, each estate pushing scale further. For Clarence Mackay, remaining modest was not an option. The competition was not openly declared, but it was unmistakable. Invitations, galas, architecture, land size, each detail became a subtle metric of status. Social columns chronicled appearances with quiet precision. A ballroom size mattered. A facade's symmetry mattered. Even the lineage of the architect mattered. Mackay understood this language fluently. He possessed the resources to build on a monumental scale, and he chose to exercise them. But the decision to construct Harbor Hill was not purely about comfort. It was about permanence. It was about carving the Mackay name into American memory through stone. His wealth flowed from industries that symbolized modernity, silver speculation, and electric communication. Yet the mansion he envisioned would evoke something far older: European nobility, classical proportion, ancestral authority. It would not resemble a businessman's house. It would resemble a dynasty's seat. This tension defined Clarence Mackay. He was both modern industrial heir and aspiring aristocrat, a product of rapid American capitalism, yet drawn toward the visual language of inherited power. Harbor Hill would reconcile those identities. But ambition of that scale rarely settles for adequacy. To compete with the Vanderbilts meant thinking beyond imitation. It meant selecting an architect of national prominence. It meant designing not just a residence, but a commanding landscape, terraces, gardens, and approaches that would unfold like a royal procession. If the Vanderbilts had built monuments in marble, Mackay would respond in limestone. If others built mansions, he would construct a palace. The plans would call for 140 rooms, expansive formal gardens, a facade modeled after a French château that had stood since the 17th century. It would overlook Roslyn Harbor as if claiming dominion over it. This was not extravagance for its own sake. It was a statement of lineage. And in the competitive theater of America's new aristocracy, there was only one acceptable outcome: to build something greater. If Vanderbilt built Marble House, Mackay would build something greater. Chapter 4. Designing a Castle, 1899 to 1902. In 1899, Clarence Mackay did not simply commission a house. He commissioned a declaration. To translate ambition into stone, he turned to one of the most influential architectural firms in the United States, McKim, Mead White. And within that firm, he chose Stanford White, a man whose name had already become synonymous with Gilded Age grandeur. White understood scale. He understood spectacle. He understood how architecture could manufacture authority. For Harbor Hill, he looked not to American precedents, but across the Atlantic, to the Château de Maisons Laffitte, a 17th-century French masterpiece long associated with aristocratic power. Its proportions were disciplined. Its facade balanced symmetry with ornament. Its silhouette communicated permanence. This was no coincidence. By modeling Harbor Hill after a French château, White was giving Mackay something America itself lacked: visual ancestry. The message was subtle but unmistakable. The Mackays might be new money, but their residence would echo old-world legitimacy. Construction began in 1899 atop one of the highest elevations on the North Shore of Long Island. The site overlooked Roslyn Harbor, granting the mansion a commanding view, not hidden within trees, but elevated, visible, deliberate. The structure rose in pale limestone, its central block flanked by projecting wings. Classical pilasters anchored the facade. A grand portico crowned the entrance. Balustrade terraces stepped outward, creating layers of perspective that unfolded toward the gardens below. From a distance, Harbor Hill did not feel domestic. It felt sovereign. Inside, the scale expanded further. Approximately 140 rooms were arranged with ceremonial precision, Reception halls, drawing rooms, a music room, a library, guest suites, servant corridors discreetly hidden from public view. The central hall rose dramatically, guiding visitors upward beneath sculpted ceilings. Light filtered through tall windows designed not merely for illumination, but for theater. Every surface spoke the language of refinement. Imported materials, marble accents, carved detailing. Nothing suggested improvisation. Everything suggested permanence. Yet Harbor Hill was never meant to stand alone. Architecture, in White's vision, extended beyond walls. To complete the illusion of aristocratic authority, the surrounding landscape required orchestration. For this, landscape architect Guy Lowell was commissioned to design formal gardens that would unfold like a controlled extension of the mansion's geometry. Terraces cascaded down the hillside. Symmetrical pathways traced deliberate lines. Manicured lawns framed distant water views. The grounds did not simply decorate the house. They amplified it. Each descending level reinforced the central axis of the mansion above, creating the sensation that nature itself had been disciplined into submission. From the upper terrace, one could see the harbor shimmering in the distance. From below, the limestone facade loomed against the sky. The experience was choreographed. Arrival, ascent, revelation. Harbor Hill became one of the largest private homes in America upon its completion in 1902. The same year John William Mackay died, his son's palace stood finished, a stone testament to inherited power. It symbolized the height of the Gold Coast era. It signaled that the Mackays had secured their place among America's ruling elite. And for a time, it appeared unassailable. But architecture, no matter how monumental, is still vulnerable to forces it cannot see. Stone can resist wind and rain. It cannot resist economic shifts. It cannot outlast cultural transformation. Harbor Hill had been designed to echo a 17th-century château, a structure that had survived revolutions and centuries. Yet it stood on American soil, in a nation barely more than a century old, powered by industries that fluctuated with markets and policy. The mansion embodied permanence. The era that created it did not. For a brief moment at the dawn of the 20th century, Harbor Hill appeared eternal, terraces gleaming, gardens immaculate, its silhouette commanding the North Shore skyline. But architecture alone does not create immortality. Chapter 5. Life Inside Harbor Hill. When Harbor Hill was completed in 1902, it did not sit quietly above Roslyn Harbor. It performed. Carriages once curved along its grand approach, wheels grinding softly against gravel. Later, motor cars replaced them, engines humming as they carried guests toward the limestone facade. Visitors did not simply arrive. They ascended, climbing toward terraces designed to heighten anticipation. Inside, scale became a spectacle. The central hall opened upward in calculated drama, ceilings adorned with classical detailing that drew the eye toward sculpted symmetry. Reception rooms flowed into drawing rooms, which opened into galleries filled with carefully curated art. European paintings lined the walls. Ornate furnishings signaled cultivated taste rather than mere expenditure. The ballroom stood as the heart of the social theater. It was here that orchestras played beneath glowing chandeliers. It was here that silk gowns brushed polished floors and conversations drifted beneath gilded moldings. Evenings unfolded with the precision of choreography. Formal dinners followed by music, then promenade across terraces where guests could overlook manicured gardens lit softly against the night. European-style entertaining shaped the rhythm of life inside Harbor Hill. Dinners were structured, courses deliberate. Seating arrangements reflected status and alliances. Every detail reinforced hierarchy. But none of it happened spontaneously. Behind the scenes, an invisible machinery sustained the illusion. Servants moved along hidden corridors and back staircases designed to keep labor out of sight. Kitchens operated like small industries. Fireplaces required constant tending. Windows demanded cleaning. The estate's vast lawns and formal gardens were clipped and measured with military precision. To maintain 140 rooms required discipline. To sustain grandeur required an army. Harbor Hill was not simply a residence. It was a system, one that relied on wealth flowing steadily from the postal telegraph empire and other investments that anchored the Mackay fortune. And for years it worked. The North Shore elite rotated through one another's estates each season. Invitations were signals of status. Being excluded was noted. Harbor Hill became a fixture within this gilded circuit, a palace equal to any Vanderbilt property in ambition. Social prestige was not inherited passively. It was performed annually. From the upper terraces, Clarence Mackay could survey the harbor and the surrounding estates, a landscape dotted with other monuments to ambition. There was competition, but also solidarity among those who had climbed to the summit of American capitalism. Yet beneath the orchestras and polished marble, a quieter truth lingered. Harbor Hill's magnificence depended on stability. Its heating systems required coal in enormous quantities. Its staff depended on steady wages. Its maintenance required uninterrupted fortune. The estate was built for a world in which wealth expanded continuously, where industrial growth appeared limitless and fortunes seemed permanent. But permanence in America had always been fragile. Even as Harbor Hill hosted its elegant gatherings, the nation beyond the terraces was changing. Cities were swelling. Labor movements were organizing. Progressive reformers questioned concentrated wealth. In 1913, a federal income tax would permanently alter the relationship between private fortune and public obligation. The illusion of aristocracy was exquisite, but it was not centuries old. It was scarcely a decade mature. Within Harbor Hill's ballroom, crystal glasses clinked in celebration. Outside, economic and political forces gathered quietly, reshaping the foundations of the very system that had allowed such estates to rise. For now, the music continued. The chandeliers glowed. The terraces remained immaculate. The palace stood unchallenged against the skyline. But beyond the harbor's calm surface, a different current was forming. Then the world outside began to change. Chapter 6. War and Cracks in the Illusion, 1914-1920s. By the time World War I erupted in 1914, Harbor Hill had already proven itself a monument to Gilded Age ambition. Its terraces gleamed in sunlight. Its ballrooms rang with music. Its 140 rooms operated like a finely tuned machine. But the world outside was shifting, and no palace, no matter how monumental, could remain untouched. The war disrupted economies across Europe and America. Industrial output soared, but wealth distribution became uneven. Labor strikes challenged long-standing hierarchies. Social structures began to shift subtly, yet perceptibly, as women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers and calls for reform rippled through urban centers. The rigid hierarchies that had once defined estates like Harbor Hill were quietly being questioned. Even more tangible was the burden of rising costs. Maintaining a 140-room mansion with expansive gardens, terraces, and staff required a fortune, one that no longer expanded effortlessly. Heating massive interiors demanded cold deliveries measured in tons. Staff wages increased as labor markets tightened. Imported materials for repairs and renovations became more expensive. What had once seemed like limitless wealth began to feel conditional. Then there was the tax system. In 1913, the 16th Amendment established a federal income tax, permanently altering the financial calculus for America's elite. Large estates like Harbor Hill were no longer insulated from public obligations. The Mackay fortune, once seemingly impervious, now faced new scrutiny and new drains on its liquidity. During these years, Clarence Mackay continued to host grand events. The estate's public face remained polished. But behind the limestone walls, accountants tallied ledgers with growing concern. Every repair, every improvement, every servant's wage became part of an invisible calculus of survival. And yet, Harbor Hill endured. Its terraces remained immaculate. The orchestras continued. Guests arrived as expected. The mansion still projected power, prestige, and permanence. To anyone visiting, nothing appeared amiss. But permanence, no matter how convincingly performed, is fragile. Each year added invisible stress. Rising taxes, increasing staff costs, the weight of a post-war economy, and a society slowly questioning the necessity of immense private wealth. These forces were imperceptible to the casual observer, but within the walls of Harbor Hill, they were accumulating quietly, inexorably. The palace still stood tall, but the foundation was weakening. Chapter 7. The Great Depression, Fatal Economics, 1930s. The Roaring Twenties had lulled America's elite into a dangerous sense of invulnerability. Stock tickers surged, industrial empires expanded, and estates like Harbor Hill continued to operate as private kingdoms. For Clarence Mackay, life at the mansion remained a performance of wealth and social prestige, an assertion that the new aristocracy could endure anything. Then came 1929. The Wall Street crash sent tremors through the nation. Within days, fortunes evaporated. Stock portfolios that had seemed unassailable were reduced to fractions of their former value. Industrial magnates, railroad heirs, and financiers alike faced a brutal reckoning. For the Mackays, whose lifestyle depended as much on liquid wealth as inherited assets, the impact was immediate and profound. Harbor Hill, with its 140 rooms, sprawling terraces, and manicured gardens, was more than a home. It was a financial obligation. Staff salaries, maintenance, coal for heating, imported repairs, and the care of extensive grounds demanded a constant flow of funds. The crash made that flow uncertain. Suddenly, the mansion's grandeur became a liability rather than a symbol of prestige. Federal and state estate taxes compounded the strain. What had once seemed like wealth enough to withstand anything was now vulnerable to public demands. Servants who had kept the house running for decades were reduced. Some were let go. Others went unpaid for months. Seasonal events were scaled back. The house, once alive with music, laughter, and ceremonial pomp, began to fall silent in pockets. Even as the Mackays sought to maintain appearances, the cracks were visible. Art collections and fine furnishings were carefully preserved, but the daily operations of the estate began to strain under the weight of diminished finances. Tasks that once seemed trivial, repairing a terrace, cleaning a wing of the house, replacing a window pane, now required budgeting and difficult decisions. For Clarence Mackay personally, the decade was a test of endurance. The weight of responsibility, to maintain not just a home, but a dynasty, a statement of American ambition, became overwhelming. He continued to host select social events, but the scale and spectacle of the Gilded Age were no longer sustainable. The mansion, so long a beacon of power, had begun to feel like a cage. In 1938, Clarence Mackay died. His passing marked more than the end of a life. It was the moment when Harbor Hill lost its anchor. The man who had envisioned, managed, and performed the estate's grandeur was gone. Without his oversight, the intricate systems that kept the palace functional began to falter. Staff shortages became permanent. Maintenance schedules slipped. The financial structure that had supported the mansion for decades was now precarious, strained by taxes, inflation, and a world that had moved past the ostentatious displays of the early 1900s. By the late 1930s, Harbor Hill had become emblematic of a broader truth. Enormous estates, no matter how carefully constructed, could not survive economic collapse unscathed. Wealth could be inherited, but the social and financial demands of maintaining a Gilded Age palace were relentless. Without constant oversight and vast resources, the mansion's opulence was no longer sustainable. And so, with Clarence Mackay's death, the trajectory of Harbor Hill shifted irrevocably. What had been a symbol of American triumph now teetered toward obsolescence. Without its master, Harbor Hill became a liability. Chapter 8: Abandonment and Decision. By the 1940s, Harbor Hill had become a shadow of its former self. The limestone facade still gleamed faintly in the sunlight, and the terraces remained impressive in scale, but the vitality that once pulsed through its 140 rooms had long faded. The estate's sheer size, once a statement of power, had become an anchor dragging down the remaining Mackay holdings. Operating the mansion required a full complement of staff: butler, housekeepers, cooks, gardeners, chauffeurs, and specialists for maintenance and repairs. Each year, wages rose. Each year, upkeep costs escalated. After decades of shifting economic realities, the Great Depression, new estate taxes, inflation, sustaining Harbor Hill as a functional palace was no longer feasible. The estate's grandeur had turned against itself, transforming permanence into a financial burden. Meanwhile, the world outside the gates was transforming rapidly. World War II had ended, and returning soldiers fueled a post-war housing boom. Long Island, once the exclusive preserve of America's elite, was being subdivided into suburbs. Developers saw opportunity in the sweeping lawns and open acreage of estates like Harbor Hill. The land beneath the mansion had suddenly become more valuable than the mansion itself. The new suburban vision of practicality clashed with Gilded Age excess. While Harbor Hill required constant maintenance, developers only saw plots that could be sold, streets that could be laid, and homes that could be built quickly and profitably. Every unmaintained window and overgrown garden represented not history, but lost revenue. Inside the mansion, remnants of luxury lingered: crystal chandeliers, gilded moldings, fine art. Yet these were mere memories. The estate no longer functioned as it was intended. The corridors echoed emptily. Servants were fewer. Rooms remained closed. The palace that once hosted royalty, dignitaries, and America's elite now stood largely silent. For the remaining Mackay family and estate managers, the choice became painfully clear. Harbor Hill was no longer a home. It was an unsustainable monument. Emotional attachment and historical significance could not offset practical realities. The decision was looming, inexorable. Either continue to pour resources into a collapsing estate or yield to the economic tide and repurpose the land. Every glance across the terraces reminded the family that time and society had moved on. The mansion that once symbolized American ambition now stood as a relic of a bygone era. Its preservation had become a liability rather than a legacy. And in 1947, the decision was made. Chapter 9, 1947 Demolition. In 1947, the inevitable became reality. Harbor Hill, the 140-room limestone palace that had once loomed over Roslyn Harbor, was set to vanish from the landscape forever. What had survived storms, economic crises, and decades of social upheaval would now meet its end not with drama, but with quiet, methodical erasure. Demolition crews arrived with cranes, wrecking equipment, and teams of laborers. They moved deliberately, stripping the estate of anything salvageable before the walls themselves were reduced to rubble. Ornamental balustrades, carved stone details, and marble hearths were pried loose and sold. Some architectural elements found new homes in museums or private collections. Others were melted down, repurposed, or lost entirely. What had been a coherent vision of grandeur was fragmented into fragments and memories. The terraces that once commanded sweeping views of the harbor were leveled. Gardens designed by Guy Lowell, so meticulously planned and maintained for decades, were bulldozed to make way for streets and suburban lots. The imposing mansion, which had once symbolized wealth, taste, and permanence, was now treated as raw material, its land repurposed for profit and practicality. Neighbors watched in silent awe, many unable to comprehend how a place of such scale and significance could disappear so quietly. There were no public protests, no national outcry. The mansion had become irrelevant to a society that now valued suburban efficiency over Gilded Age excess. The social and economic currents that had allowed Harbor Hill to exist had shifted irreversibly, leaving the estate as a relic of ambition out of step with the post-war world. In the process of demolition, Harbor Hill transformed from a living statement of power into a historical footnote. The rhythm of destruction was cinematic in its own way. Walls collapsing, terraces crumbling, gardens disappearing under layers of earth-moving equipment. Dust filled the air, and the horizon where the mansion had stood became a blank canvas. Yet even as the stone fell and the gardens vanished, Harbor Hill did not entirely disappear. Pieces of its grandeur were scattered: architectural fragments, salvaged artifacts, and the lingering stories of those who had walked its corridors. In books, photographs, and the collective memory of Long Island, the mansion survived. Its shadow extended into literature as well, whispered as an inspiration for F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby. The destruction of Harbor Hill was not an accident. It was the culmination of decades of economic strain, changing social values, and the inexorable rise of post-war suburban development. What had once been a palace was now land. What had been a symbol of permanence was now a foundation for new streets and homes. The grandest private mansion of its era, a jewel of the North Shore Gold Coast, had ceased to exist in its entirety. Its scale, ambition, and artistry had been erased with calculated efficiency. But though its walls were gone, its story endured. Harbor Hill did not entirely disappear. Chapter 10, the Gatsby connection. Even after its demolition, Harbor Hill continued to exert influence, not on maps or in the physical landscape, but in the imagination. Its grandeur, its terraces, its immensity, and its European-inspired elegance became part of the cultural memory of Long Island's Gold Coast. And nowhere is this more evident than in literature. F. Scott Fitzgerald, who spent time observing the estates along the North Shore in the 1910s and 1920s, drew inspiration from these palaces when creating The Great Gatsby. The novels West Egg and East Egg were fictional mirrors of this region, representing old money and new money, ambition and ostentation, reality and fantasy. Harbor Hill, with its commanding presence and Gilded Age excess, fits neatly into the mythology that inspired Gatsby's legendary mansion. Mackay's house embodied the very qualities Fitzgerald exaggerated in his novel. Sweeping terraces, sprawling gardens, and an architecture designed to impress both guests and neighbors. It was a stage for social spectacle, a place where wealth and ambition performed for the world. In this sense, Harbor Hill was not just a home. It was a character, a template for aspiration, desire, and the illusion of permanence. Yet there is an irony in the comparison. Gatsby's mansion survives in literature, immortalized in Fitzgerald's prose, forever glittering and inaccessible to readers' imagination. Harbor Hill, by contrast, exists only in photographs, fragments, and archival records. Its physical reality was swallowed by demolition, repurposed land, and the inexorable march of suburban development. The mansion that once seemed eternal, designed to endure, to outlast generations, vanished within decades. This contrast highlights the fragility of physical legacy versus the endurance of myth. While Harbor Hill crumbled under economic pressures and changing societal priorities, Gatsby's home continues to captivate. The mansion became larger than life in fiction precisely because it no longer exists in reality. In death, Harbor Hill became immortal, but only in imagination. In many ways, Harbor Hill's story underscores a central tension of the Gilded Age, the collision of aspiration and impermanence. These estates were monuments to human ambition, built with the intent of signaling dominance and refinement. But wealth alone could not protect them from social, economic, or historical forces. Only the narrative, the story, the legend, could survive unscathed. Gatsby's mansion survived in fiction. Harbor Hill did not. Chapter 11, Final Reflection, America Devours Its Castles. Harbor Hill was not an anomaly. It was part of a pattern that unfolded across Long Island's Gold Coast, and indeed, across the United States. The grand estates that once lined the shores, palaces built of limestone, marble, and ambition, were never meant to endure the pressures of history. They were monuments to wealth and ego, and as such, they were fragile in ways that few who built them could have imagined. The collapse of these mansions was driven by forces both personal and systemic. Federal and state taxes slowly eroded fortunes. Wars and economic upheavals shifted resources and priorities. The rise of democracy and the suburban ideal demanded practicality over ostentation. Streets, cul-de-sacs, and tract homes replaced terraces and gardens once reserved for the elite. The landscape of ambition was physically redrawn. These estates required more than money. They required vision, discipline, and timing, a perfect alignment of fortune and society. Ambition could construct something monumental in a single generation. But permanence, it seems, required humility, foresight, and perhaps a recognition that even the greatest human achievements are subject to decay. Harbor Hill, like many of its peers, was a victim not merely of economic forces, but of cultural evolution. Society no longer valued palatial extravagance. Wealth that once commanded deference now needed to justify itself in utility. What had been celebrated as a symbol of achievement became, in a matter of decades, an untenable burden. And yet, the ruins of these estates, whether fragments of stone, photographs, or stories passed down through generations, retain a strange power. They remind us that ambition, while dazzling, is ephemeral. They remind us that human desire for permanence often clashes with the impermanence inherent in time, society, and fortune. Harbor Hill's terraces are gone. Its gardens are gone. Its limestone walls, which once declared American power, now exist only in memory and record. But the story endures. It is a cautionary tale of pride and vision, of wealth and fragility, of the transient nature of human grandeur. America replaced its castles with streets. Cul-de-sacs now wind where fountains once played, lawns once stretched, and chandeliers once glowed. The legacy of ambition remains, in our culture, in our imagination, and in the stories we tell about what was lost. The question lingers: if wealth and power cannot guarantee permanence, what can? And in a country built on ambition and reinvention, how many more harbors' hills wait silently beneath the suburban streets, their grandeur erased but never forgotten?